This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Majid Nawaz.
And here it is. Many people, during his meteoric rise to global prominence as a commentator, were writing to me and suggesting that Dr. Jordan Peterson and I should have a conversation. Well, it finally happened, and you're about to hear that conversation. Now, in approaching this conversation, I could have taken one of two routes. Some of you may well have seen the now viral interview that shot Dr. Jordan Peterson and his latest book, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos to Fame. Of course, that book is published by Penguin Books in January 2018. Now, that interview that shot him to fame and went viral was an interview on Channel 4 with Kathy Newman, which, for various reasons, came to represent precisely the sort of mindset that Jordan Peterson sought out to challenge and said was part of the problem. And he couldn't have hoped for a better example than that interview itself. I asked him about that interview in my interview. But as I said, I had one of two choices to make. I could have gone down that route and challenge him on practically everything he said, and I don't think that would have done you the benefit nor the service of actually hearing from the man about his own views in his own words. I felt that would have been injecting myself into the interview, which I didn't think was necessarily the right way to go about it. So instead, the approach I adopted was to ask questions, listen to the answer, and ask questions off of the back of the answer. You know, remember those good old days when that's what interviews used to sound like? And so that's the approach I took. Now, that's not to say, may I caveat at this stage, that I agreed with everything he said. Of course I didn't. There in fact were moments where I did quite strongly disagree, but I left those for another time because I think it wasn't the time to have that out in this interview. So here you're about to hear my interview with Dr. Jordan Peterson, a professor at the University of Toronto, a clinical psychologist, author of 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos, and author of Maps of Meaning, and recently better known for some quite, I'd say, stark and candid opinions. Jordan, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for the invitation.
It's with somewhat a particular interest that I wanted to speak to you, because a lot of what you've been through with the response to your work, I have some empathy for. But let me begin with this. You're known for providing advice to young men online, many of whom are listening to your messages. And if I could distill the core message that you advise young men to pay attention to, it's that they could be far more than they currently are. Could you explain that for me, please?
Well, people have an unspecified potential for development, educationally, obviously, with regards to the skills they have, but also in relationship to their character. And it's much more encouraging for people, I think, to concentrate on who they could be rather than who they are, especially when they're young, because they still have most of their life ahead of them, and they're not everything they could be yet. And so to tell people even something like, well, you should feel good about yourself the way you are, it's like, well, that there's something there that's seriously lacking, because there's so much more that you could be, that you need to be, and that you should be aiming at. The problem with being okay the way you are is that you don't have a goal then. And people need to have a goal in order to come to terms with their life.
Why is that controversial? That doesn't sound controversial to me, but it has been met with some controversy. And one of your somebody was speaking to you at one stage, and they said, "Well, I think it's working." And he said, "And nobody ever told you that? Why has this become? It seems forbidden."
That's a very good question. I mean, I think it's something like this. We've been convinced, let's say, at many levels of our society, primarily by university-led indoctrination, that our culture is an oppressive patriarchy, and that if a young man takes his place in that world, attempts to move ahead, say, attempts to pursue an ambition, then he's following this tyrannical, patriarchal route, and that there's something reprehensible about that he's contributing to the oppression of others or to the destruction of the planet if you take the environmentalist route. And so there's been this terrible pall cast on achievement-related ambition, even if it's in the service of character development. And it's partly because we have this unidimensional view of our culture as a patriarchy, as fundamentally tyrannical. And that's being pushed extraordinarily hard, and it's very demoralizing to people. It's far more demoralizing than people generally realize. And I actually think that demoralization is part of the underground reason that narrative is being put forward. So the fact that the universities are participating in that is so appalling to me that I can barely formulate my thoughts on it properly.
I can see you feel passionately about it. So what you're saying is no.
Yeah.
Joking. Now, here we have a common understanding when it comes to looking at issues that relate to young men, that there's a bit of a crisis of masculinity. So in the United Kingdom, one of the biggest killers of young men is suicide. Now, that's not because young women don't try and kill themselves as much as young men. It's that young men, when they try and kill themselves, what they've realized when they study this is that they are more decisive.
Yeah, they use lethal means. Women commit suicide, attempt suicide more often, but men are much more effective at ensuring that they die.
I mean, have you looked at that? What does that tell you about young men and women when they're facing depression?
Well, men are more aggressive than women, statistically speaking, which is why the overwhelming majority of people in prison are men. So because the most aggressive people are men. And so men are more likely to use violent means when they do something that's violent, like damaging means. And so you see this in domestic violence statistics as well. Women are more likely to hit their husbands than the reverse.
This is what you're saying from what you've studied, right?
Yeah, the statistics on this are quite clear. But of course, men are more likely to use high levels of force. So, and it's part of innate aggressiveness. And, you might say, well, what's your evidence that that's innate? It's like, well, there's endless evidence that it's innate. Although, of course, these things are modified by cultural phenomena.
I'm particularly interested in the suicide, though, because, I imagine that's a result of depression. Now, is that depression a consequence of this crisis in masculinity, young men not knowing how to be a man in the modern age?
Well, it's a good question.
And if so, is the antidote to simply reinforce some of the traditional, some would say, of course, toxic masculinity, some of the traditional roles of men which haven't seemed to have, they haven't seemed to necessarily have been 100% correct in the way, historically men have treated others, especially women.
Well, the thing is, I don't like that narrative. I think it's an appalling way of viewing history. Look, the way that history lays itself out to me, the first issue is that for most of human history, the common person had a pretty damn rough life. It was hand to mouth. And so if you look in the Western world, in 1895, the average person lived on less than $1 a day in today's money, which is below the current UN guidelines for abject poverty. And so that's only 140 years ago, essentially. And so you could argue about who had it worse, men or women, but it's a rather futile argument in my sense. Men were shipped off to war in droves. That wasn't particularly pleasant. They did almost all the absolutely catastrophically dangerous work. And so, that was rough. But of course, women had it rough too, man. Lots of them died in childbirth, and lots of them, if they had children, if they didn't die in childbirth, their children died before they were a year old. And life was brutally difficult, and people didn't live to be that old. And so my essential reading of history is that our ancestors were pretty viciously oppressed by the basic conditions of life, and that essentially what they did in response was to cooperate with one another to try to make things the least amount of dismal possible.
Through a division of labor.
Yes, and yes, and it isn't as if it was only in 1960 when the feminists had their way that men finally woke up and loved their partners. That isn't how things worked. And so this narrative of universal oppression has reached so deeply into our culture that we have to take it for granted that the fundamental way of viewing history was men against women and men won. It's like women were very different 130 years ago. They didn't have reliable birth control. That's a really big deal. They didn't have reliable toilet facilities. That's actually a big problem. They didn't have any way of dealing with menstruation that was efficient. That didn't even occur until like the 1930s and wasn't in really widespread use till the 1970s. Like, these are big technological changes. And we write that all out of history and say, well, the reason that women had such a dismal time was because men were oppressing them. It's like, sorry, no. That's not an appropriate way of looking at the past.
To move to the suicide issue and the depression, then, what is, in your view, causing the biggest killer of young men in the UK?
Well, there's lots of reasons for depression. It's a very complicated phenomena, but it's certainly the case that many people have issues of depression because they're aimless. to the degree that their depression isn't being caused by endogenous factors, medical factors, because that's often a problem. And it takes careful diagnosis to tear those things apart. But people need a purpose in their life, because life is difficult. Life is suffering, according to our great religious traditions. And that's an essential truth. And in order to cope with that suffering properly, you have to have a noble purpose in your life. And if you associate the pursuit of that noble purpose with fortification of the oppressive patriarchy, then you take the legs out from underneath people who are trying to make their way in the world. And that's happening to young men in droves. Yes, I would say in droves, and it's not a good thing. And it is definitely facilitated by the postmodern neo-Marxist doctrines that are rife in the universities, which make the assumption that our society is fundamentally tyrannical in its essential nature. I mean, it's partly tyrannical because every society is corrupt to some degree, and power plays a larger role in movement up a hierarchy than might be optimal, right? Because no system is perfect. But we do pretty damn well. Our societies are pretty free. And very few people are hungry. Most people have decent levels of shelter and decent freedom. We can walk on the streets in safety. We can aggregate together in crowds without anything terrible happening. And to me, these are miracles because that's not the case in most of the world.
That's Dr. Jordan Peterson pulling no punches with his candid views, his, some would say, rather controversial approach to discussing issues related to social justice, to patriarchy, to depression. But nevertheless, he is one thing that can certainly be said about him, is that he speaks very, very candidly about what he believes, which others may find very refreshing. So stay with us. We're going to continue with that interview after the break. You're listening to Majid Nawaz here on LBC, and the time is 2:15.
Leading Britain's conversation. LBC with Majid Nawaz.
Yes, it's Majid Nawaz here on LBC interviewing Dr. Jordan Peterson. We're going to go straight back to it. You just heard in that first segment him discuss his views on the history of patriarchy and the suicide of young men and depression. Let's go straight back to that interview. I've been aware of your work mainly online, and we've communicated a few times online. But I first saw you speak, and this is ironic, in the interview I referenced earlier, and that's the Cathy Newman view on Channel 4. Because to this point, you've mentioned, yes, society... there are many reasons why life is difficult, and one of them is oppression, but there are many other reasons. So to this point...
like dozens of other reasons.
Indeed. Cathy Newman raised the gender wage gap with you, and your answer struck me as being somewhat similar, that one of the elements for one of the reasons for this wage gap could be...
unreasonable prejudice.
That's right.
Sure.
But you said there are many other reasons. Now, she didn't take that well.
No, her attitude was... if you don't think the wage gap is caused by the prejudice of powerful white men, then you're a bad person. Which is that's her implicit argument. And that's just not a good argument. I mean, Warren Farrell, who's a very interesting character, wrote a book called Why Men Earn More. And he actually wrote it for his daughters because he was trying to figure out how they could maximize their earning potential across their lifespan. I mean, he wrote it for popular consumption as well. But he identifies all sorts of reasons why men make more money. And they don't make that much more money, so you don't need that many reasons to account for it. But here, men take more dangerous jobs. Men are more likely to move. Men work longer hours, and if you work 14% longer hours, you make 44% money, 44% more money. The return is nonlinear. So men tend to work in industries that are scalable. So women prefer care jobs, or that's not exactly right. Most of the people who are in human care jobs are female. But the problem with those jobs is they don't scale. You can't take care of 10,000 people, but you can provide electronic resources to 10,000 people. So there's all these complicated reasons why men and women differ in their pay, including, for example, that women are more agreeable than men, and agreeable people aren't as good at negotiating on their own behalf with regards to salaries, and that women tend to bail out of high-level positions in their 30s so that they can have kids, which is a perfectly reasonable choice. But that has to be all obliterated, because the fundamental truth of the matter is that the West is an oppressive patriarchy, and all differences between groups are to be attributed to oppression. So you can't even have a discussion about that.
If somebody has fundamentally misunderstood this multivariate analysis to why there could be a gender pay gap, how would they go about attempting to close this gap if they wanted to?
Well, I don't know. The first question is just like, should the gap be closed? The gap is also a very complicated thing. You know, there's a disproportionate number of extremely high-paid men, but they're a tiny minority. But they skew the statistics as well. So, are you talking about the median person? Or are you talking about the average person? Because the average is the wrong statistic, because it includes that tiny proportion of people who make an incredible amount of money, and almost all of them are men. And like, so the first question is, does the gap exist? And the answer is, well, that's a lot more complicated than you think, and a univariate analysis isn't going to reveal it. The second is, if it does exist, like, why does it exist?
Let's explain for our listeners what you mean by univariate.
Yeah, well, univariate, uni means one, and variate means variable, and so if you're not thinking about things in a differentiated manner, you take your ideology, whatever that is, and it has a cause, say oppression, and then you say, well, oppression is causing this disequilibrium. It's like, well, it's possible, and no doubt somewhat true, but there's many, many other factors that have to be considered, especially if you're going to address it seriously. You know, and we're not capable in the least of having serious conversations of this sort. You know, I never hear, when people are worried about differential representation of men and women in occupations, I never hear people, women, let's say, who are concerned about this, or the leftists who are concerned about this, complaining about the fact that 99% of the bricklayers are men. But they are. You can go on the U.S. Department of Labor site and you can rank order occupations by gender. And there's the heavy trades are overwhelmingly male represented. Those are hard, grueling, difficult jobs. They tend to pay quite well. It's like, why don't we see the radical leftist types who are beating the drum for equality concentrating on the disproportionate number of men who occupy trades positions? Well, those aren't the high-end, high-status jobs, and apparently those are the only ones that matter. But there's no reason that they matter. And what about the disproportionate number of men in prison? Are we going to do gender equation for prison cells? I've heard feminist scholars seriously propose that, by the way, which is, to me, it's a sign of absolute insanity.
And if somebody wanted to go about, I mean, the part of this pay gap that is related to an unfair prejudice against women, you concede that part of it may well be.
Maybe.
Yeah. So if somebody...
I don't think the evidence for that is strong. Actually, if you do the controls, you actually find that in many situations now, especially for young single people, women have a wage advantage, not a disadvantage.
That may change as they continue, though, no?
Oh, yes. Well, the motherhood issue is a killer, right? And that's something that our society needs to sort out, but we don't know how.
It's life-giving, not a killer.
Well, that's it. It's hard on your career progression.
Yeah. What about paternity leave? Does that fix the motherhood issue?
No.
Why not?
Well, because I don't think it isn't obvious how we can equate the demands of childcare across the genders, or that we should, or that people actually want that. Now, this is muddy water because we don't know precisely. My sense is that the primary burden for childcare for infants, well, during pregnancy, obviously, but for the year after and maybe the year and a half after is going to fall disproportionately on women. It's easier for women to take care of infants than it is for men to take care of infants.
Breastfeeding is a factor.
Well, that's actually a factor. And breastfeeding actually turns out to be extraordinarily important for children's development.
I have a 1-year-old. He's actually now 14, 15 months roughly. And honestly, that's what we did. She took time to breastfeed while I focused on this job right here.
Well, and you know, partly what you do in that situation, I think, is that for the first year, the man takes care of the mother and the mother takes care of the baby. Now,
if it's an optional thing whereby after that year, the father also has an option to take off time after the year, after the breastfeeding may not be as crucial, and then looks after the child, so the mother doesn't take too much time away from work. Is that an option you'd be prepared to consider as...
Well, I think that's an option that couples have to discuss. It's up to the couple to determine how to do this. Yeah. But these things are very complicated. So there's a study a while back that showed men... imagine you're getting a group of women to rate the photographs of men for attractiveness. And then imagine that you're testing the hypothesis that one of the things that women might find attractive in men is their willingness to share domestic duties. And so then you show the women pictures of men engaged in typical domestic activities like vacuuming or doing the dishes, or you show them engaged in typical masculine activities, say like mowing the lawn or fixing something outside. The women reliably rate the men who are doing male typical behaviors as more sexually attractive. So these things are complicated. You know, and we think, well, if everyone had goodwill and we just split the tasks equally, then everything would work out. It's like, Don't be so sure about that. Well, here's an interesting issue that's never talked about with regards to gender equality. So, and this is a very well documented fact. If you look across societies, women mate across and up socioeconomic status hierarchies. So a woman will date and marry someone who makes the same amount of money for her or more. All right. So, and that's true regardless of the egalitarian nature of the society. It holds true in Scandinavia as well. Because you might say, well, that's because of women's lower socioeconomic position. But you can equate for that and you don't get rid of the phenomena. So one of the things that's driving the aggregation of wealth into fewer and fewer hands is the proclivity of well-off women only to marry men who are as well-off as they are or greater. Men will marry across and down socioeconomic status hierarchies. So if we're going to enforce equality, does that mean that we don't allow women to marry men who are richer than them?
You're speaking in this way, and I'll tell you while listening, I mean, I dare I say that most men know this in their gut.
Yes, they certainly do, which is why they're driven to attain status.
So Kathy Newman, in that interview that I referenced, pushed back at you in a way that sent the interview viral, and that's how I first came across. And then I started looking into it, and of course that's what brings us here. But it's not just the way in which Kathy didn't receive your views well, it's the way in which online certain memes emerged. For example, this one I recently saw placing a photograph of you next to Adolf Hitler in the headline of the article. You know,
that was Forward magazine. They took that photograph down, by the way.
Yeah, but it went up, and
yes, it certainly did.
I want to explore that first. And you're a clinical psychologist. Speak to me about the psychology of people receiving your views and immediately going to the analogy of Hitler.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's very straightforward, and it happens to me all the time. But it's understandable. I am not a fan of the radical left. And I'm not a fan of
It's understandable they do it, or it's understandable one can analyze what they're doing?
Well, both. I mean, the reason that they do it is because, let's say that you have adopted a postmodern Marxist view of the world, and that you think that dividing people into their collective identities and viewing the world as a battleground between interest groups is the appropriate way of looking at the world. And reasonable. That's what a reasonable person would do. And I come along and say, look, not only is that unreasonable, but it's very much akin to these murderous doctrines that did tens of millions of people in the 20th century. Okay, but you hold that viewpoint. Now you have, you don't have very many options under those circumstances. If I'm reasonable, you have to contend with my argument. If I'm not reasonable, then you can just categorize me as not reasonable and ignore me. And the best way to categorize me as not reasonable is to assume that I'm on the farthest end of the political spectrum away from you as possible, along with the reprehensible Nazis and the alt-right types, and just assume that that's me. The problem is it's not me. And if it was me, I would have been taken down 2 years ago. And the proof that it's not me is that I have 300 hours of lectures online from my entire academic career, and I haven't said a single thing that anyone has ever found that's even remotely associated with a radical right-wing viewpoint. And quite the contrary. I don't like identity politics at all. And I don't care if the leftists are doing it or the right-wingers are doing it. It's reprehensible in my estimation. Now, people say, well, you go out after the left-wingers more. It's like, well, yeah, because they dominate the universities. And that isn't my opinion. That's well documented.
That's an interview with Dr. Jordan Peterson. We will be continuing that interview. Stay with us. Right now, it's time here on LBC for the news headlines at 2:30 with Tim Humphrey.
Majid Noirs on LBC. Text 84850.
For those of you catching up, we're in the middle of a long-form interview that I did with Dr. Jordan Peterson, and we're going to go straight back to it, and I'll be asking him questions, and he has some really interesting responses. This is Dr. Jordan Peterson. Comparing people that say things that are against the standard narrative to Hitler is known as Darwin's law. One would assume when hearing... these people who are making these analogies assume when they hear you speak that you're somehow more against the left than the right, as you've just mentioned. So what are your views on what's commonly called the alt-right, and where do you stand regarding the alt-right?
Yeah, well, the alt-right, to the degree that it exists, it's not a very well-documented phenomenon. No one really has any idea what proportion of the population has alt-right leaning. Yeah, well, and I think you see that more in Europe now than you do in North America, by the way. Yeah, well, the immigrant crisis here has precipitated a fair bit of that, and it's not so intense in North America. So, the alt-right types are also identity politics players. So they adopt the collectivist viewpoint, which is that the best way of defining people is by their group identity. The left's narrative is, well, there's a dominant group, and that would be like white males fundamentally, and they should give up power because they've been oppressive, and it would only be fair if resources were distributed more equitably. And the right-wingers say, yeah, I get the collectivist thing. We should identify with our groups. I'm going to identify with my groups, and so let's assume these are right-wing white supremacist types. They think, fine, I'll identify with my damn group, but I'm not giving up any power. And my sense of playing identity politics is my goddamn group is going to win, and yours is going to lose. And so, but if you play identity politics, you're going to get both of those responses. The left say, well, that's reprehensible. It's like, yeah, but what's reprehensible about it is the playing of the identity politics. It's reprehensible across the entire spectrum.
What's the antidote to that?
The antidote to that is the antidote that the West discovered like 2,000 years ago, which is, look, we need a low-resolution general narrative to construe the structure of existential reality. We have to orient ourselves with a story that's too simple, but basically hits things correctly. The story in the West is the individual is sovereign. The important thing about you and me isn't the fact that you're Muslim or I'm, nominally Christian, or that we have a different ethnicity. Those are things that are real, but the fundamental thing is whether or not we can encounter one another as individuals outside our group and communicate and negotiate and compete and cooperate in peace. That's the fundamental thing. And that's the right antidote to collectivist identity politics, is that the individual is sovereign. And free societies all around the world, and there aren't very many of them, are all predicated on the implicit assumption that the individual is sovereign and that that's the appropriate categorical approach. And the universities are doing everything they possibly can to reverse that.
Moving to universities, I've often defined identity politics as the trumping of individual rights by group identity.
That's exactly what it is.
And your first, I suppose, the first way in which you captured the world's attention was at university. And that's what I want to talk about now, because the C-16 law in Canada was being proposed. And what I think many people that are cross-examining you and your views are confusing is what exactly you are opposed to.
Yeah, they think I'm opposed to transgender rights.
Yeah, and of course your stance on this, including the stance of Lindsay Shepherd, sort of shot you to the public eye. And so speak to us a bit about that and exactly contextualize for us what it is precisely that you were opposed to in that. Yeah,
case. Well, Bill C-16 purported to do nothing but extend human rights provisions to an excluded group, let's say, to the transgender and non-gender binary types, and that was the federal legislation. It also made it a hate crime to discriminate or harass, essentially. So now then the question is, well, what exactly do you mean by discriminate or harass? And why exactly is that a hate crime under the criminal code? Well, there was an answer to that. The answer was, well, this bill will be interpreted in light of the policies generated by the Ontario Human Rights Commission. Very large set of policies. Now, the Ontario Human Rights Commission is a radically leftist organization. I think it's the most dangerous organization in Canada, although you could debate that. And they said all sorts of policies about how this legislation was going to be interpreted, and the federal government linked to their website to state that Bill C-16 would be interpreted in light of those guidelines. So I went and read all the policies. Well, one of the policies was that if you didn't use the preferred pronouns of a given group, that you could be charged essentially with a hate crime. And I thought, no,
which given group is that? You're talking about transgender people.
Yeah, and so there's all these pronouns that have come up. There's 70 different sets of pronouns approximately to hypothetically describe people who don't fit anywhere on the gender spectrum, which is also something that I don't really understand. I don't understand that conceptually.
We'll come to that, but I just want to hear the story of this bill first.
Okay, so now a person is compelled under Canadian law to use the pronoun of another individual's choice on pain of law. And I thought, well, no, that's not acceptable. It's one thing to put limits on what a person can't say, like say with hate speech laws, which I also don't agree with, by the way, but that's a different argument. I think it's a narrower argument. But to compel me to use a certain content when I'm formulating my thoughts or my actions under threat of legislative action, I thought, no, what's happened there is the government has introduced compelled speech legislation into the private sphere. It's never happened in the history of English common law. And so I said, there's no way I'm abiding by that. I don't care what your damn rationale is. We're compassionate. It's like, no, you're not. No, you're not. You're playing this radical collectivist left-wing game. You're trying to gain linguistic supremacy in the area of public discourse. You're doing that using compassion as a guise, and you're pulling the wool over people's eyes. And you're not going to do it with me.
Could that same rationale be used for... In the UK, Holocaust denial isn't illegal. People that deny the Holocaust are seen as crackpots. Yet in Germany, it's illegal. The rationale that was used to put this law forward in Canada, do you see any form of similarity between those that would suggest, for example, in the name of compassion, that Holocaust denial should become a crime?
Yeah, well, it is a crime in Canada, actually. It has been since the 1980s. And I think that was a dreadful mistake. And it's not because
it's not here, by the way.
No, well, that's good. I'm glad to hear that. It's not like there's no such thing as hate speech. It's not like there's no such thing as reprehensible, hateful speech. Obviously, those things exist. That's not the issue. You're always balancing risk. So one risk is you let crackpots utter hateful dialogue. Risk number one. Risk number two is you hand over to the state the definition of hate and the ability to police the speech of individuals. That's risk two. For me, risk two far outweighs risk one. Partly because if you let the damn crackpots have their say, most reasonable people listen to them, assume they're crackpots, and that's the end of it.
This is a traditionally English liberal argument you're making.
Exactly, that's exactly it.
On option two there, basically the state deciding what you can or cannot say and defining it as hate. Speak to me about Lindsay Shepherd and what happened to her.
Well, okay, so when I took my stance against Bill C-16, the first thing that happened was a variety of left-wing lawyers came out of the woodwork and said, you're exaggerating the danger. Now, luckily, the university immediately sent me 2 letters telling me I should stop saying what I was saying. See, I made the videos criticizing the bill, and I said when I made the videos that they were probably illegal. That it was probably an illegal act to make the videos criticizing the legislation.
It hadn't become law yet.
No, but it was law in provincial law still. It hadn't become federal law, so the legal framework was already there. So, people said, well, you're exaggerating the danger. You won't be hauled off to jail, which, by the way, is not true, because if the Ontario Human Rights Commission finds you guilty of harassment and fine you or subject you to forced re-education, and you refuse to do it, it's tossed into the normal legal system, and then if you don't listen to the normal legal system, you're found guilty of contempt of court, and then you can be jailed. So jail is a perfectly possible outcome. All right, so I said, well, I think this is probably illegal what I was doing. And the left-wing lawyer type said, you're just exaggerating the danger. You're a radical, you're exaggerating the danger. But the university had their lawyers review what I was doing, and they immediately concluded that I was probably breaking the law too. And under the provisions of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, the same dreadful organization, if you're an employer in Ontario, you are as legally responsible for the utterances of your employees, whether you know about the utterance or not, whether or not they made it when they were working for you or on their free time, and whether or not they intended any offense. So the university read that and thought, we have to stop Peterson because we're on the hook for his utterances and what he's doing might be illegal. So they sent me 2 letters telling me to stop, which was horrible because my job was on the line, but which was good because I said, well, this is how the law is constituted, and there's immediate proof. And then a few months later, this graduate student, 22-year-old graduate student named Lindsay Shepherd at Wilfrid Laurier University dared to show a 5-minute clip of a public television show where I was debating Bill C-16, a very mainstream public television show.
Pretty much saying what you're saying now.
Exactly the same kind of discussion we're having now. And she was hauled in front of a Maoist inquisition consisting of 2 of her half-wit professors from the communications department, radical Marxists both, and an administrator from the University of Wilfrid Laurier University who was hired to persecute students in this particular situation.
What happened to Lindsay?
Well, they told her that she was in violation of Canadian law. And she had the sense to record this. And, well, there's complicated reasons for that, but she made the recording public. And it went viral. It was the biggest scandal that ever hit a Canadian university. Then...
What did they say that it's like playing Hitler?
Or Milo Yiannopoulos. That I'm either Hitler or Milo Yiannopoulos, because these left-wing radical types can't even get their damn insults straight. It's like, really? I'm like Milo Yiannopoulos or Hitler? What kind of thinking is that? And first of all, and to use the casual comparison to someone like Hitler, I think that's an appalling ethical crime. You use that accusation under very, very specific circumstances, when something extraordinarily serious and dangerous has happened, because otherwise you risk diluting the currency of the comparison. And that's the last thing you should do if you care about such things as Wilfrid Laurier they apologized to her formally. They set up a panel to reconstitute Wilfrid Laurier's policy on free speech. But last week, the only 2 professors on the panel who were pro-free speech resigned because the university had watered down its policies so much that it was pointless for them to consider. They didn't learn a damn thing.
That's our interview with Dr. Jordan Peterson. Stay with us because there's more of that to come. You're listening to Majid Nawaz on LBC and the time is 2:45.
This is LBC with Majid Nawaz.
Yes, you're listening to my interview with Dr. Jordan Peterson, and we're going to go straight back to it. It'll take you to the top of the hour, so stay tuned. More to come. Here we are. We've been discussing so far about the law compelling people to use pronouns, certain pronouns over others. But if I was sitting here in front of you as a transgendered male to female or female to male, and we began the conversation, at the beginning of the conversation you stumbled and called me he or she, and I was perhaps identifying the other way around. And then if I'd said to you, please, I'd rather go by she, how would you respond to that on a personal level? How would you?
Well, it would depend on the situation, but the way I have responded to that, because I've had a number of conversations with transgendered individuals, is that I use whatever pronoun seems to go along with the persona that they're projecting publicly. It's the simplest thing to do. Now, if we were...
You would respect their choice on an individual level?
Yeah. But with a more... contentious pronouns, je and je, and that sort of thing, that's a whole different issue. Because the question there is, well, exactly what is it that you're doing when you're asking me to use those words? Like, are you compelling me to play your particular ideological game, or is this actually a matter of some personal identity that's important to you? And those things are not obvious. And so, in a situation like that, the first thing I'd have to do is to try to figure out just exactly what was going on in the situation, and that's not simple. And so there would be no foregone conclusion that I would address you by the pronouns of your choice. And the first thing I'd want to find out is that just a narcissistic power play? Because that's actually the most likely outcome.
All right. So, but if it was a simple he or she, and they made a request of you, you would respect that request on an individual level?
Yeah, well, it appears that way, because I've watched myself in those situations, and that seems to be how it turns out.
You're on the record as saying that liberalism and conservatism through psychometric testing can be explained through certain psychological profiles. What sorts of psychological profiles make a liberal versus a conservative?
Yeah.
And what are the values of both?
People vote their temperament. Now, it doesn't account for everything. There's lots of influences on voting patterns, but temperament is certainly one of them. Well, conservatives are people who are high in trait conscientiousness, which breaks down into industriousness and orderliness. They're particularly orderly on the conscientiousness dimension. And they're low in another trait, which is openness. And openness is the trait that predicts creativity. Philosophical, literary, artistic, aesthetic creativity, and lateral thinking. So conservatives are not creative by temperament, but they're conscientious. And conscientiousness is a good predictor of life success in managerial and administrative domains. So you might think that the conservative is a person who's adapted for a hierarchy where the roles are well defined and so are the proper actions. So conservative will slot him or herself into that and then play out the defined roles and be successful at that. The downside to conservatism is, well, what happens when those roles or that hierarchy is no longer functional? And then that's when the liberal temperament actually kicks in properly. So liberals are high in trait openness. And so that's the creativity dimension. So the advantage to being a liberal is that you're more adapted when things are changing rapidly. So the liberals generate things and the conservatives implement things.
So, I'm interested in the way in which if the hegemony shifts, at the moment, for example, you're saying liberals have the hegemony in the academia, in the cultural and artistic spheres of life and influence, especially in your domain where you're working, sorts of areas and audiences you speak to. Liberals are pretty much in charge in universities. So does the hegemony affect that? Because in that sense, a conservative in that environment would be an insurgent who's not working within the system.
Yeah. Well, how
do you explain that? Because of course,
it isn't often the case that you get hierarchies that are completely dominated by liberal types.
And of course, to reference a kind of what's popularly conceived of as an alt-right media outlet, Breitbart often takes the view that because they say that politics is downstream from culture, they're encouraging conservatives to get involved in defining culture. Now, again, can that be explained through the hegemony shift and the fact that conservatives are currently, they perceive themselves as insurgents or,
It's a good question. We haven't been in a situation that I know of that where these things have been studied in depth. It isn't generally the case that liberals dominate entire hierarchies. That isn't generally how it works, because the hierarchies are usually set up so that conservatives fill up the hierarchies. It's in the nature of hierarchy. Something happened in the universities, and it's not obvious what, to allow whole swaths of disciplines, the humanities in particular, but also the social sciences, to become almost completely dominated by, well, not liberals exactly, but people on the left. The humanities and social sciences are dominated overwhelmingly by people on the left. And so all of a sudden now you have a left-wing hierarchy. Well, no one knows what to do about that. It's like, what do you mean a left-wing hierarchy? That's not supposed to happen. But it has happened. And so, and the consequence of that is that, well, this particular collectivist view is being promoted as the only way of looking at the world.
What about free speech? Because, of course, that's something you've said earlier in many interviews, actually, is something that is core to your value set. Now, free speech, when it came to what in America are referred to as liberals, let's call them a left wing, but the big kind of, campus protests back in the 60s against censorship, against McCarthyism, that was driven primarily by free speech. But the axis of interest around defending free speech seems to have shifted from the left, and now conservatives are often using, in some cases, populists abusing, I'd say, this value of free speech to hide behind it with which to advocate for their own views.
Well, I think what's happened is actually something deep that's happened. Back in the early 60s, the campus leftists still existed in a classically liberal milieu. So the notion of freedom of speech was sort of self-evident as a truth. But we've deviated so far from that now that, like, within the collectivist framework, there is no right to free speech. Because there's no such thing as free speech. Not even technically. It's not even technically possible. All there are utterances that further your attempt to dominate in the name of your group. And so when the radical leftists look at the political dialogue, they don't see people attempting to express their free ideas as individuals. They see power players in a group-fostered landscape playing their power games. And so they say, well, when we're restricting free speech on campuses, or that's what we're accused of, we're not restricting free speech. We're protecting the rights of oppressed minorities. Free speech isn't a game within the postmodern collectivist landscape. You have to approach the world from the perspective of the notion of individual sovereignty and individual citizenship to even think of free speech as a possibility. Because what free speech is the attempt on the part of sovereign individuals to orient themselves in the world, process to update it.
One of the great political footballs of our times, and the way which involves the left, let's say the populist left as well as the populist right, is the question of Islam in the West. You've described yourself as a nominal Christian, and then you describe yourself as speaking to somebody who is openly identifies as a Muslim. Where do you stand in this great question of Islam in the West, the role of Muslims in the West, integration, extremism, and some of the challenges around the values such as free speech? I'm thinking, for example, blasphemy in the show, and all of the issues that arise from that, including, for example, some of the populist left's perhaps defense of some of these issues in the favor of Islamist Muslims, and some of the populist right's animosity towards the presence of Muslims in the West. Have you thought much about this question? Yeah, but not enough. Because it's a question that, to answer properly, I have to know a lot more about Islam than I know. But here would be my questions. Okay, first of all, I'm not willing to assume axiomatically that all belief systems are commensurate with Western democracy. And the reason I'm not willing to assume that is because there are hardly any Western democracies. So the belief systems of most of the world aren't commensurate with Western democracy. So the rule of thumb shouldn't be, well, people from all cultures are just as likely to support Western democratic ideals. It's like, no, obviously not, because those ideals only are present in a tiny minority of countries. We don't know how they got to be present there. Now, I would suggest that some of that has to do with the Judeo-Christian emphasis on the sovereignty of the individual, but also more technically maybe in Christian societies on the division between the church and the state. Now, and that's a division that isn't formally expressed in Islam. And so I don't know, I have a hard time conceptualizing Islam because I can't figure out if it's fundamentally religious or if it's fundamentally political. Or maybe it's an amalgam of both in a manner that it's not easy for a Westerner to identify. Mm-hmm. So I have some sympathy towards people who are curious about whether Islam has a tilt towards totalizing.
like other doctrines have, a tilt towards totalizing. And I would say the evidence for that is that it isn't obvious that Islamic countries have been able to give rise to sustainable Western-style democracies with fundamental emphasis on individual rights and responsibilities. So it's an open question. But, you know, the people tend to think, well, the ethic, the individual rights / responsibility ethic of the West is somehow self-evident, and it's agreed upon by people broadly throughout the world. It's like, I don't see it that way. I don't think that's the case. Now, the way forward, as far as I'm concerned, is to begin the process of the various serious discussions that are necessary between Christians, Jews, and Muslims, essentially, because I do believe this is fundamentally a religious issue, about how those systems of belief are commensurate, whether they can coexist in the same space, how that might be negotiated, what that would mean theologically and metaphorically. And, you know, that dialogue, I don't think that dialogue has even really begun.
Jordan, let me say to you that as a Muslim speaking to you now, I invite you to have that dialogue. I'm perfectly happy to have that dialogue with you. There's some of what you said that I think we could explore a lot further in another venue, given the appropriate time.
Well, I hope we can do that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Jordan Peterson. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Nice talking with you.
Now, I assure you all that Jordan and I have followed up on that. He's accepted my invitation to tour together to speak about Islam in the West, integration, Muslim extremism and terrorism. We will be keeping you up to date with that as it develops. But that's all from me for now. I'll be back next week for the regular weekend show. If you missed that, you can catch up with that interview and, of course, the rest of the show on our catch-up feature that you can download from the LBC app for iPhone or Android, and you can tap on catch-up. Leading Britain's conversation at 6 is Clive Bull, but right up next, it's Andrew Castle.
Majid, thank you very much indeed. You didn't even say gotcha to him. I would have thoroughly enjoyed it if you had. That was really interesting. I mean, you're tough enough to follow, let alone Jordan Peterson.
I think refreshing, isn't it? To just hear people say what they think, whether you agree or disagree.
It is, and that's what this is about. It is an open debate between now and 6 o'clock.